Well, hello, folks out there in YouTube land. Got a very interesting story for you today. All right, I've been wanting to cover this for a while. The man behind the movie, the Tony Robinson saga. Now, I've not done a video quite like this, but I've been wanting to do it for quite a while. Spent quite a few days on this, and I wanted to talk about Tony Robinson because he was at the University of Tennessee the same time I was, which was in the 80s. Now, he was the starting quarterback, a senior at the time, and I was a freshman golfer. So we weren't exactly swimming in the same waters, so to speak. But he was usually at Gibbs Hall. I don't know if he lived there full time or if he was just there for meals and things like that, because that's where all the football players pretty much were. He was a senior, so he might have been living off campus. But I remember him because, again, when the starting quarterback walks in, you know who that is. He had no idea who I was. But he was a heck of a quarterback. He was fantastic. He was the type of quarterback you see today, the Mahomes type of guy, the Hendon Hooker, the guy that could run, he could throw, he could do it all. And if he got out in the open field, he was gone. So let's talk about Tony Robinson and how he wound up at UT and then how they wound up making a movie out of the guy. And it's a heck of a story. All right, now Tony, in his early years, he came out of the state of Florida. He was a son of a truck driver, and he lived in Tallahassee. Now, folks started noticing what an athlete he was, and when he went to Leon High School and played there, as soon as he became a sophomore, he took over the team and became the starter, and he was their quarterback for 3 straight years. He was the state player of the year. He threw for 6,500 yards, 75 touchdowns. He only lost 4 ball games in those 3 years. They were 29-4. Well, Johnny Majors noticed him and started recruiting him. A lot of other teams did not because they didn't feel like he was sturdy enough. He was kind of a lean, wiry type of player, very quick, but he wasn't very big. But Johnny Majors went ahead and recruited him anyway. And he wound up signing with the VOLS, and he was there as a backup in 82 and 83. Well, in 1984, he took over the team, and he wound up going 7-4-1 and had a very nice season. And it was pretty obvious he was going to be the starter the senior year as well. In 1985, there was a ton of hype about Auburn coming to Tennessee. And Auburn was the #1 team in the country, and Bo Jackson was everything. I'm telling you, this guy was a superstar. And Auburn thought they were going to waltz in and just whoop up on the Vols and run all over us. Well, I was at that game, and that did not happen. I can tell you the entire state of Tennessee was waiting for that game. We couldn't wait for Bo Jackson to get there. And our defense stifled him like you can't believe. They absolutely wore the guy out. And prior to the game, Sports Illustrated had already done this big article, and they put the big thing about Bo Jackson being the Heisman candidate and all of that. That was the plan. Well, it wound up Tony Robinson got on the front of the Sports Illustrated because he played so well in the game, and they called it the Tennessee Waltz. Well, at that point, everybody started talking about Tony Robinson winning the Heisman. I remember that being a big deal, and I was really excited about it because I thought we could win the whole thing and win the national title. And after that game, Bo Jackson said, Tony Robinson is a super guy. If his O-line continues to block for him like they did today, he will probably win the Heisman. And that was directly from Bo Jackson. And as the season went along, we went and played Alabama. And we were winning that game. It was going really well. And then the ACL tear occurred. When he got caught, I believe it was Cornelius Bennett and another fella hit him high and low. And it wasn't a dirty hit or anything. And it bent his knee back and it tore his ACL, and it was devastating. I remember I saw the hit and I was like, oh, no. And I knew he grabbed his knee immediately. It was awful. And I really thought the season was almost over at that point, but it really wasn't. Daryl Dickey came in and played well for Tony, and actually took us to the Sugar Bowl where we beat Miami. But it was really bad for Tony because he went into some depression and started having all kinds of problems. We're going to get into that now. Tony had a tough time with this injury. Back then, an ACL was devastating. I know these days that people come back from it and they're fine. It takes a year, but they come back 100%. Back then, that wasn't the case. It was really a bad injury, and for many athletes, it kind of just took them out. And this led to depression, and then he got into drug use, and then he wound up getting arrested, had to go to jail, and it became a nightmare at that point. All of the acclaim and everything that he was as a football player, which is, as an athlete myself, I understand you almost become that person. You become, the guy that did this or the guy that did that. And then when you get injured, all of a sudden you're not that person anymore. And it's really hard for people to deal with that. Some can handle it and some can't. Tony was unable to deal with that at the time, and he made some really bad decisions, and that led to him spending a lot of time in jail. Now, here is the interesting part of that bad part of his life. He got an opportunity to play for the Washington Redskins during the strike. And if you'll remember back then, the NFL, the players went on strike, and they hired a bunch of players that used to play college ball. They called them scabs, and they formed teams. And, of course, the Redskins coach reached out to Tony, and on a work release program, he wound up suiting up for the Washington Redskins. And in a big game against Dallas, where a lot of the former players had already crossed the picket line, you had Danny White, Tony Dorsett, Randy White. You had a bunch of their best players had crossed the picket line, and it looked like they would definitely win that ball game. And I remember it well. Washington played Dallas and wound up beating them in that game, and Tony Robinson played as quarterback. And, he didn't have a huge game, but he played well enough, and he threw for 152 yards, and they won that ball game 13-7. And after that ball game, he had to return to prison, of all things. And the Redskins went on to win the Super Bowl, and Tony didn't get a ring. He didn't get any of those things. And we're going to talk about that later in this video. But this obviously inspired Hollywood. And they decided to write a movie called The Replacements. And they chose Keanu Reeves, who was a big star at the time, as the quarterback, and Gene Hackman as the head coach. So you had two big stars. They went a little different direction. And, of course, Keanu Reeves was actually in two football movies. One is Shane Falco in The Replacements. He also played Johnny Utah in Point Break.
This is Johnny Utah. Ohio State Buckeyes, all conference, remember?
Yeah, I got my knee folded back about 90 degrees the wrong way.
Whoa, that's why you never went pro?
So he actually was pretty good at playing a football quarterback. But he played for the Washington Sentinels, and of course they won the big game against Dallas and all of that. It was a very inspiring story, and also it was a great movie. It was very funny. It was very much a comedy, but also you had all the great football scenes, and it was pretty much a guy movie. They did have some romantic stuff in there with the real pretty cheerleader and all that. It was a really fun movie. I remember it, and I'm sure you do too. It wasn't that long ago.
The players' strike became official at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
We're going to use replacement players, but they all have something unique to bring to the game.
Hey, Scab! Hey, Falco! You're not even a has-been! You're a never was!
Now, since all of that, Tony continued to have problems, but in 2008, he became a free man, and during the day, he paints houses. On the weekends, he helps coach kids. He also officiates for high school games and does things like that. And he spends a lot of time helping kids with sports and understanding that. And I'll give you his direct quote. It's important to let kids know just because you got in trouble doesn't mean your life is over. You can still turn this thing around and still be a positive role model. And the Redskins, in the end, finally issued a Super Bowl ring for Tony and all of the replacement players that played for the Redskins, which helped them get to the Super Bowl because their replacements won 3 games, and those games counted towards the playoffs. Without that, they wouldn't have got into the playoffs. They'd have never won their Super Bowl. So they finally decided that the replacements deserved a Super Bowl ring, and he got his. So I was not aware that he was the inspiration of that movie. I didn't put 2 and 2 together there. I guess I should have, but I didn't. But anyway, I want to tell you that story about Tony Robinson. I was at those games. I watched him. One of the best players you'll ever see. He was so good, and he would have been back then, that was not a time where you had the dual threat quarterbacks like you do now, but he was so good, he would have made it in the NFL, no problem. If he played today, he'd be making $1 million a year at UT or more, and he would go to the NFL and be a first-round draft pick easily, no question whatsoever, because the way they play football these days, it's all about a dual-threat quarterback, and he was ideal for it. So I wanted to bring you the Tony Robinson saga, and it really is, and his redemption story, and it's been a very eventful life for him, very high highs, very low lows, but an interesting sports story, no doubt. And if you like this content, be sure to hit that like button. Let's remember to continue to cover all these big sports stories. If you've not subscribed, hit this little button right here. I'd appreciate it. It won't cost you a dime, and it helps me out. And right over here is the most recent video YouTube thinks you'll enjoy based on your viewing history. And we'll see you next time on Sports Talk Jay.